I want you to picture something. A city built on water. No walls of farmland around it. No forests to feed it. No mines beneath it. And yet for centuries, Venice behaves like a superpower. How? Because Venice didn't rule by territory. It ruled by access, trade routes, ports, contracts, secrets. And there's one secret in particular that turns this story from beautiful Renaissance craft into something that feels a lot closer to an old world reset. Mirrors. Not the cheap kind. Not the kind you hang in a hallway. I mean the kind that could buy you a house. The kind kings fought over. The kind a government treated like a weapon. Here's the first hook. If mirrors were just luxury, why did Venice trap the people who made them? Why were master craftsmen forbidden to leave? Why were escape attempts hunted like betrayal? And why do documents from the era read less like business policy and more like containment? Because the moment you stop calling this art and start calling it control of light, the whole story changes. Venice, late 1400s. The city's canals carry silk, spices, precious metals, letters, diplomats, and spies, sometimes in the same boat. In that era, power isn't only about armies. Power is about information, about seeing before others see, about shaping what others believe they saw. And few crafts in Europe were guarded as aggressively as Murano glass and Venetian mirrors. To understand why, you have to cross a short stretch of water to an island that was basically a gilded quarantine zone. Murano. Most people hear Murano and think souvenirs and tourists. But Murano began as a strategic decision. In 1291, Venice ordered glass furnaces moved to Murano. Official reason: fire risk in the main city. That's true, but it's not the whole truth, because moving the furnaces did something else that mattered more. It concentrated the masters. It made them easy to monitor. It separated them from the world while keeping them close enough to exploit. That's a template you'll see again and again in old world stories. Step 1. Relocate the knowledge holders. Step 2. Surround them with privileges. Step 3. Quietly remove their freedom. Then, if the outside world changes, you can rewrite the story while keeping the output. And what Murano produced wasn't glass. It was a kind of controlled perception. Let me explain. In the medieval and early Renaissance world, glass was difficult. Large sheets were difficult. Perfectly flat surfaces were difficult. But a mirror required something even more extreme. It required a surface so flat and so carefully polished that it behaved like a clean plane of reflection. Then it required a silvering process, an amalgam, usually tin and mercury, sometimes enhanced by other metals, applied in a way that bonded evenly and didn't cloud. If any of that failed, the mirror became a blurry, distorted curiosity. The Venetian ones didn't. They were crisp, bright, deep. As some accounts described them, like the reflection had distance. To people who lived with candlelight and smoky rooms, a perfect mirror wasn't just an object. It felt unnatural. It felt like a portal to a cleaner world. That's why courts obsessed over them. That's why nobles paid insane sums. And that's why Venice built a cage around the people who knew how to make them. Because the real secret wasn't a single recipe. The real secret was repeatability, the ability to produce consistent precision on demand. That's not art, that's system knowledge, and system knowledge is what empires steal. Now here's where the story gets sharp. Murano masters were given privileges that sound like rewards. They could carry swords, they could marry into higher classes, they could receive legal protections other craftsmen didn't get. On paper, it looks like Venice honored them. In reality, those privileges were a leash, because at the same time, the The Republic issued decrees. Masters were forbidden to leave Venice without permission. Some Venetian texts describe the relationship in a way that feels chillingly modern. Not, "you work here," more like, "you belong here." The state grants privileges, and the state can revoke them. Your workshop exists because a license exists. Your raw materials arrive because the port allows them. Your reputation spreads because Venice stamps it as Venetian. That's why leaving wasn't framed as personal choice. It was framed as theft. Not theft of objects, theft of capability, theft of a competitive edge. And once a capability is framed as property of the state, the person carrying it becomes something the state can justify owning. Leaving wasn't treated like quitting a job. It was treated like treason. Economic treason, state betrayal, and the enforcement wasn't symbolic. Venice had the Council of 10. If you know Tartaria content, you'll recognize the vibe immediately. Not because this is Tartaria, but because the mechanism is identical. A centralized authority controlling knowledge, controlling narrative, controlling movement. The Council of 10 operated quietly and efficiently. State security was their domain. And for Venice, glass and mirrors weren't just a market, they were state security, because they represented an advantage that other nations couldn't simply buy in bulk. They had to replicate it, which means they had to steal it. So the masters were watched, and the masters knew it. Imagine what that does to a person. Your skill makes you rich. Your skill makes you important. Your skill also makes you a prisoner. You're allowed to prosper, as long as you never walk away. And then you hear rumors. France is offering fortunes, protection, freedom, a new workshop, a new life. And suddenly the island starts feeling less like a guild and more like a lock. Now do the 3 coincidences test. If this was only about money, explain 3 things at the same time. First, why forbid travel at all instead of letting masters roam and simply buying their loyalty? Second, why offer privileges like swords and noble marriages, status upgrades that keep them emotionally tied to the state? Third, why pursue escape attempts as if the knowledge itself was the true property? Any one of those has a normal explanation. All 3 together feel like containment. And that's why this story fits your format. Because it's not magic, it's a very human machine. Secrecy, monopoly, and fear. Now add the most brutal part. Mercury. The amalgam silvering process involved mercury, and mercury fumes are toxic. Even people back then noticed something. The mirror masters often didn't live long. They developed tremors, mood changes, memory issues, early deaths. Some historians treat this as the tragic cost of an industrial craft. But look at it through a more unsettling lens. A secret that kills its carriers is a secret that becomes even easier to control. Because fewer healthy masters means fewer apprentices. Fewer apprentices means fewer leaks. And because the technique lived in bodies, not books, Venice could protect it simply by controlling the bodies. That's not a conspiracy theory. That's how guild knowledge functioned for centuries. It lived in hands, in timing, in judgment, in the feel of the material. You can't steal that from a library. You steal it by stealing people. And other nations tried. France wanted the technique more than anyone, because France understood something Venice understood. Mirrors were psychological power. A room filled with reflections multiplies light. It multiplies perceived space. It multiplies luxury. It overwhelms visitors. It makes a palace feel larger than life. Mirrors don't just show wealth, they manufacture it, visually. And in a world where kings used architecture as propaganda, mirrors were silent propaganda. That's why Versailles becomes relevant later. not because mirrors are mystical, because they are perception architecture, and perception is power. So France begins making offers. There's a reason France didn't simply buy mirrors forever. Buying keeps you dependent. Stealing the technique makes you independent. And independence is what creates new power. So French courts didn't only send merchants, they sent persuaders. The kind of men who knew how to speak to a trapped master. Money, status, protection, a new name. Sometimes the offer wasn't even about wealth. It was about dignity. Come build freely. Come teach. Come be more than a prisoner. And you can see how a man would break for that. Because a cage lined with gold is still a cage. Discreet offers. Letters mention payments. Promises of protection. Privileges. Sometimes false identities. In modern terms, it looks like early industrial espionage. Talent extraction. Venice responds by tightening the cage, repeating the exit bans, strengthening penalties, making examples. Some chroniclers describe craftsmen fleeing toward Northern Europe. Some were convinced to return, others vanished under unclear circumstances. And in that era, unclear circumstances usually means one thing. If a state wants a leak to stop, it doesn't always need a public execution. It needs silence. It needs fear. It needs one disappearance that makes 10 others stay. Now, I'm not saying every lost craftsman was murdered. History is messy. People die of illness. People fall off boats. People get robbed on roads. But when a government writes policy that treats craftsmen like state assets, it tells you how they think. And the way Venice thought was simple. The knowledge does not belong to the individual. It belongs to the Republic. That line, whether written explicitly or implied, should hit you. Because that is the exact logic of every reset. Take knowledge out of families. Take it out of guild lines. Put it under state control. Then, when the time is right, you can rewrite who invented it, who built it, and who deserves credit. The product stays. The origin story changes. And later generations inherit a polished narrative. Now here's a twist that makes this feel even more old world. Venetian mirrors weren't only prized for optical quality. Collectors and inventories describe elaborate frames, often with astronomical symbols, geometric motifs, patterns tied to proportion and cosmic order. Most historians explain this as Renaissance taste, and that's fair. The Renaissance loved geometry, harmony, the idea that the universe is mathematical. But in old world terms, geometry is never just decoration. Geometry is the language of systems. It's how you tune architecture, how you tune optics, how you tune craft. In that era, science and symbolism overlapped. Astronomers, artisans, alchemists, architects, these worlds weren't separated by modern categories. Light wasn't only physics, it was philosophy. It was a metaphor for truth, divinity, and knowledge. A perfect mirror became a symbol of perfect understanding. Reality reflected without distortion. So the Mirror Master wasn't just a worker, he was a specialist in precision, light, and material behavior. He held a form of knowledge most people didn't even know existed. Now ask yourself, in a world where navigation depends on instruments, where astronomy is advancing, where lenses and optics are beginning to change warfare and science, do you really think mirrors were just luxury, or were they a visible tip of a deeper optics ecosystem? Because optics leads to lenses, lenses lead to telescopes, telescopes lead to maps, navigation, and military advantage, and Venice sat at the center of trade routes. So mirror secrecy might be about more than palace vanity. It might be about keeping a lead in precision craft, a lead that could spill into other technologies. Now zoom out for a second and look at the wider optics landscape. The same centuries that obsess over mirrors also begin accelerating lenses. Navigation depends on sight. Warfare depends on seeing first. Astronomy depends on better instruments. And Venice was a hub where craftsmen, metal workers, and glassmakers were unusually concentrated. Even if mirror making was separate from lens making on paper, the material knowledge overlaps: purity, flatness, polishing, controlled heating, surface behavior. That's why Venice, of all places, becomes linked to the rise of optical instruments. Not because Murano masters were secretly building modern devices, because the city sat on top of an ecosystem of precision craft. And precision craft is the seed of technological eras. Now let's jump forward. The 1600s. France, under Louis XIV, wants to overwhelm Europe. Versailles isn't just a palace, it's a statement. It's a machine designed to produce awe. And the Hall of Mirrors becomes the perfect symbol of that strategy. But there's a problem. France doesn't have Venice's mirror quality. French workshops can make glass, but large, flat, brilliant mirrors? Not reliably, not at scale. So France does what states always do. It tries to import the missing human knowledge, and gradually, it succeeds. And here's the part that feels like a mini reset inside the story. Once France begins producing mirrors at scale, the public explanation changes. Suddenly, it's inevitable progress, as if technology naturally flows from one nation to another like weather. But behind that progress are people, moved, bribed, threatened, renamed. Behind it are workshops quietly rebuilt to copy a method they didn't invent. Behind it are states writing new origin stories the moment they can manufacture the result. That's the pattern. First, you steal the function. Then, you claim the heritage. Then you tell future generations it was always yours. France establishes a royal glass manufacture. Over time, processes improve. Quality rises, prices fall. Venice's monopoly weakens, not overnight, but like a dam developing cracks. And this is another pattern you should recognize. Secrets don't die because someone admits them. Secrets die because systems replace individuals. Industrialization shifts knowledge from bodies to procedures, from guild lines to manuals, from "my father taught me" to the factory standard. That's where the true secret collapses. Not because it's exposed, because it becomes reproducible without the original keepers. But before that happens, Venice fights like a state that knows it's protecting the future. Because for a merchant republic, reputation is everything. If Venice loses the aura of superiority, it loses more than revenue. It loses trust, it loses influence, it loses leverage in negotiations, and leverage is what Venice is made of. So punishments remain severe, even as leaks increase. Because the goal isn't only to stop every leak. The goal is to maintain the message. Venice is still the source, even if it isn't. That's narrative control. And narrative control is a kind of power that outlasts the actual technology. Now here's the part that hits hardest. When you read this story in normal textbooks, it's framed as economics, trade, luxury markets, industrial competition. All true. But the tone of the decrees, the surveillance, the travel bans, the privileges, the pursuit, it feels like something else. It feels like fear. Fear of losing a technological edge in a Europe moving toward modern science. Fear of losing control of light, literally and symbolically. Because controlling light means controlling image. And controlling image means controlling perception. And controlling perception means controlling power. Even today, Now think like a reset. What happens when an era changes? When a knowledge monopoly collapses? When industrialization spreads? When empires replace republics? You don't just lose a market. You lose the story that made you special. So you preserve what you can. You rewrite what you can. You archive what you can. And you keep the public-facing myth clean. Venice becomes romance. Murano becomes art. The harsh mechanics of containment get softened into guild tradition. And the human cost, the watched lives, the trapped families, the mercury sickness, gets turned into a footnote. That is how history becomes less dangerous, by smoothing it, by making it aesthetic. Now I want to connect this back to your channel's core feeling. The old world wasn't always primitive, and modern narratives often flatten complex systems. This Venice story is not proof of Tartaria, but it's proof of a mechanism that explains how sophisticated knowledge can exist, be controlled, then be redistributed under a new narrative. It's the same pattern you see in erased stories. Concentrate the experts, control their movement, control their output. Then, when the world shifts, claim the results while denying the original structure. If you were born later, you'd look at a mirror and think it's normal. You'd never feel the state behind it. But in Murano, the state was everywhere. In who you married, in whether you could leave, in whether your apprentices were approved, in whether your workshop was watched, in whether you were allowed to live long enough to pass your knowledge on. So here's the question that keeps turning in my head. If these artisans were so valuable that they couldn't even leave an island, what kind of knowledge makes a worker into a luxury prisoner? Was it only economics, or was it optics, precision, control of light? At a time when light was becoming the frontier of modern power. Because if that's true, then Murano wasn't just an artisan district. It was a containment facility, a beautiful one, a profitable one, but still a cage. And it leaves you with one uncomfortable realization. History doesn't erase things only with fire. Sometimes it erases them with praise. It calls containment honor. It calls monopoly tradition. It calls surveillance protection. And centuries later, we repeat the softened version because it's easier to live with. The mirrors reflect faces, but the story behind them reflects something darker, a state that understood the value of a secret and was willing to silence the people who carried it. Let me give you one image that captures the whole mood, because sometimes a system is easier to understand as a scene. Imagine a Murano master at the end of a workday. His hands are stained. His lungs burn from fumes he can't name. He's proud of what he made and terrified of what it cost him. On his wall hangs a privilege, proof he's allowed to carry a blade like a gentleman. But in his pocket is a different paper, a travel permission request, waiting for a stamp that may never come. Then a visitor arrives, not a tourist, not a buyer, a man with calm eyes and careful words, a man who doesn't ask to purchase a mirror. He asks to purchase the knowledge. He offers a route, a boat, protection, and a new workshop across the border. And for a moment, the master tastes freedom. Now cut to the next morning. The workshop opens as normal. The furnaces roar. The state continues. And one chair at the workbench stays empty. Whether that man fled, was stopped, or was convinced to return doesn't always show up as a dramatic record. Sometimes the only trace is silence, a name that stops appearing on lists, a family that suddenly becomes quiet. That's why this story doesn't need myths. The mechanism is real. Control the knowledge, and you control the people who carry it. And if you're wondering why this matters now, remember, The tools change, but the strategy doesn't. When a technique shifts power, someone will try to own it, lock it down, and rewrite where it came from. Murano is just an early, beautifully lit example. This video is a narrative-driven exploration for discussion and immersive storytelling. It is not presented as verified historical fact.